December 14th, 1944. The Ardennes Forest, Belgium. Staff Sergeant James Rothwell crouched inside the cramped turret of his M4, a 3 Sherman, his breath forming clouds in the frozen air. Through the narrow gunner's periscope, he watched German Panther tanks emerge from the tree line, their long 75mm guns traversing toward his position. His hand moved to the firing pedal, but his mind was already calculating something the officers at Fort Knox had never taught him, something they had explicitly forbidden. Around him, stacked against every available surface inside the turret basket, were loose 75mm shells, not secured in the armoured wet storage bins beneath the floor where regulations demanded they be stored, not jacketed in water-filled containers designed to prevent catastrophic ammunition fires, just raw, exposed rounds within arm's reach, ready to be grabbed and slammed into the breech in 3-second intervals. It was a violation of every safety protocol the Ordnance Department had written. It was also the only reason Rothwell and his crew were still alive. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The loader, Corporal Eddie Martinez, already had his hand on the next shell. No fumbling with armoured floor hatches. No reaching down through the turret basket to access ammunition boxes that required the turret to be at specific angles. Just grab, load, fire. Again and again. The kind of sustained rapid fire that turned a standard Sherman into something that could match the German tank's firepower through sheer volume alone. What Rothwell understood in that frozen moment, and what the Army would take months to officially acknowledge, was that the modification designed to save Sherman crews from fire had inadvertently created a different kind of death sentence. One measured in the seconds it took to access ammunition when a Panther's gun was already trained on your position. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. To understand how American tank crews ended up choosing fire over German shells, we need to go back 2 years earlier, to the North African desert where the Sherman first earned its deadliest nickname. In 1942, when the first M4 Shermans rolled off American production lines, they represented the pinnacle of US tank design. The 75mm M3 gun could fire up to 20 rounds per minute under ideal conditions. That theoretical rate of fire exceeded nearly every other tank in the world. German Panzer IVs managed roughly 15 rounds per minute. Soviet 34s could sustain about 8 to 10. The Sherman's combination of a spacious turret, a well-trained loader, and intelligently positioned ammunition racks created a perfect storm of rapid-fire capability. The early ammunition layout was a loader's dream. 12 to 14 ready rounds were positioned around the base of the turret basket, exactly at waist height. The loader could reach them without bending, without looking away from his work, without hesitation. Additional rounds were stored in sponson racks along the hull sides and in a ready rack at the loader's feet. For a skilled 3-man turret crew, this arrangement meant the first 15 to 20 rounds could be fired almost continuously. In tank combat, where the first few shots often determined who lived and who died, this was everything. But there was a problem. A terrible, burning problem that would haunt Sherman crews from Tunisia to the Siegfried Line. When German anti-tank rounds, or shells from Panzer IVs and Panthers, penetrated a Sherman's armour, they often struck these exposed ammunition racks. The propellant in a 75mm shell burns at approximately 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit. One penetrating hit could ignite a ready rack, which would ignite the next rack, creating a chain reaction of fire that would consume the entire tank in seconds. Crews called it brewing up. The British called Shermans Ronsons, after the cigarette lighter company. Though that specific nickname is likely apocryphal, the sentiment was brutally real. In 1943, after analysing combat reports from North Africa and Sicily, the US Army conducted tests at Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland. They loaded a Sherman with a full ammunition complement and subjected it to simulated penetrating hits. The results were damning. 90% of penetrations to the fighting compartment or turret caused an ammunition fire. Carbon dioxide extinguishers, the standard fire suppression equipment, proved completely ineffective. Only large quantities of water could fight the inferno, and there was precious little water inside a burning tank. The Ordnance Department scrambled for a solution. Engineers proposed surrounding ammunition racks with water-filled jackets. The concept was simple. If a shell penetrated an ammunition rack, the water would absorb the heat and extinguish any resulting fire. Initial tests showed promise. Out of 14 ammunition cells punctured by 37mm and 75mm shells, only 2 caught fire. By mid-1943, the solution was formalized as wet ammunition storage. All main gun ammunition, except for a small ready rack, would be stored in armored boxes beneath the turret basket floor. These boxes were surrounded by a mixture of water and ethylene glycol, held in place by a system of concentric cells. The arrangement added 900 pounds to the tank's weight, but reduced ammunition fire rates from nearly 90% to just 10 to 15%. On paper, it was a triumph of engineering that would save thousands of lives. But there was a cost measured not in weight or complexity, but in the one resource that mattered most in tank combat: time. The new wet storage system required fundamental changes to the Sherman's interior layout. The turret basket, that metal floor that rotated with the turret and gave the crew a stable platform, had to be mostly removed. What remained was a partial platform suspended from the turret ring. To access ammunition, the loader now had to open armoured doors in this partial floor, then open the armoured boxes beneath, then extract shells from their water-jacketed containers. The ready rack, previously holding 12 to 14 immediately accessible rounds, was reduced to just 6. For the loader, the job became exponentially harder. Those first 6 rounds could still be fired quickly. But after that, the loader had to pull open floor doors, identify which box contained which type of ammunition, open the armoured container, pull out a shell dripping with water and glycol, close everything back up, then load the gun. All while the tank was potentially moving, taking fire, or traversing its turret. All while German tanks were aiming at them. The rate of fire, that proud 20 rounds per minute capability, plummeted. After the initial ready rounds were expended, experienced crews were lucky to manage 8 to 10 rounds per minute. Less experienced loaders struggled to maintain even 6. In a sustained engagement, where ammunition expenditure climbed into the dozens of rounds, the difference was measured in minutes. Minutes where German guns kept firing while Sherman loaders fought with floor hatches and wet ammunition boxes. The tankers noticed immediately. Reports began filtering back from units receiving the new wet storage Shermans in late 1943 and early 1944. The modifications were saving tanks from catastrophic fires. That much was undeniable. But they were also getting tanks killed in a different way. When a Panther could fire accurately at 2,000 meters and a Sherman had to close to under 1,000 meters to have a chance of penetration, every second of sustained fire mattered. Every hesitation by the loader was potentially fatal. Staff Sergeant James Rothwell learned this lesson in Normandy, 3 weeks after D-Day. His company of 17 Shermans encountered 6 Panthers in the Bocage country near Saint-Lô. The engagement lasted 11 minutes. By the end, 9 Shermans were destroyed or disabled. Rothwell's tank survived because his loader, Corporal Martinez, had been fast enough, experienced enough, to keep shells moving into the breach, even while working the cumbersome wet storage system. But Martinez had also watched a friend's tank brew up after taking a hit to the turret, the wet storage doing exactly what it was supposed to do, keeping the ammunition from igniting. The friend died anyway, because in the time it took his loader to access more ammunition after the ready rack was empty, a second Panther had fired again. That night, while the company regrouped and mourned their losses, Martinez approached Rothwell with a question that would become a whisper repeated in tank parks across Europe. "Sarge, what if we just kept the ammo where we could reach it, like the old tanks?" It was a forbidden question, one that violated written orders from the Ordnance Department. Wet ammunition storage was mandatory in all new production Shermans and was being retrofitted to older models as quickly as possible. Crews were explicitly ordered not to remove ammunition from the protected storage. The reasoning was sound. Yes, it slowed the rate of fire, but it prevented the catastrophic fires that had killed so many tankers in North Africa and Sicily. But Rothwell was also a pragmatist. He had seen the numbers. In his battalion, more tanks were being destroyed by German guns than by ammunition fires. The wet storage protected against one threat while exposing them to another, and in combat, crews made their own calculations about acceptable risk. The modification started small, a few extra rounds kept in the old turret basket ready racks, officially for immediate readiness. Then a few more. Then entire sponson racks loaded with easily accessible ammunition, the wet storage boxes beneath the floor used only as backup storage. It spread through tank companies like wildfire, shared in hushed conversations between loaders who understood that their speed meant survival. By the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, when Rothwell found himself facing Panthers in the Ardennes, the practice had become an open secret. His crew carried at least 30 rounds in easily accessible locations throughout the turret and sponsons. The wet storage boxes beneath the floor still held the majority of the ammunition complement, 65 rounds sealed in their water jackets. But for the critical first minutes of any engagement, the ammunition was exactly where it needed to be, within arm's reach. The Ordnance Department knew, company commanders knew, even battalion commanders knew. But they also knew the statistics. Units that maintained rapid fire capability, even at the risk of ammunition fires, were surviving engagements that destroyed units that strictly followed wet storage protocols. It was a grim calculus, but one grounded in the mathematics of survival. The German Ardennes offensive, launched on December 16, 1944, would prove this calculus correct in the most brutal way possible. As Panther and Tiger tanks smashed through American lines in the frozen forests of Belgium, Sherman crews found themselves in exactly the kind of close-range, high-intensity combat, where rate of fire mattered more than fire prevention. Rothwell's unit, part of the 7th Armoured Division, found itself fighting a desperate delaying action near the town of Saint-Vith. The Germans needed the road junction. The Americans needed to buy time for reinforcements to arrive. For 3 days, outnumbered Sherman platoons traded shots with superior German armour in conditions that turned every engagement into a knife fight. On December 18th, Rothwell's tank, nicknamed Fury Road by the crew, took up a position in a destroyed barn on the outskirts of town. On December 18th, Rothwell's tank, nicknamed Fury Road by the crew, took up a position in a destroyed barn on the outskirts of town. The temperature had dropped to 15 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside the tank, the crew's breath crystallized on every metal surface. The hull gunner, Private First Class Tommy Chen, stamped his feet trying to maintain circulation. The driver, Technical Sergeant Bill Henderson, kept the engine running despite the noise, knowing that a cold engine might not restart when they needed it most. Through his periscope, Rothwell spotted movement. 3 Panthers, advancing in a staggered formation along the tree line. Their long-barreled guns swept back and forth, hunting. The nearest was perhaps 900 meters away. Close enough. Just barely. Traverse right, Rothwell commanded quietly into the intercom. Panther, tree line, 11 o'clock. The turret whined as it rotated. Martinez already had a high-explosive round in his hands, pulled from the rack directly beside him. Not from the floor, not from a water-jacketed box. From the sponson rack that officially should have been empty but held 36 rounds of mixed ammunition types. AP next, Rothwell said, though Martinez already knew. The first HE round would be for ranging and distraction. The second would be armour-piercing, aimed at the Panther's weaker side armour as it reacted to being hit. The gunner, Sergeant Frank Kowalski, centred the crosshairs on the lead Panther's hull. On target. Fire. The 75mm gun bucked. The HE round streaked across the snow-covered field and detonated against the Panther's frontal armour, doing no real damage but announcing their presence. As Rothwell predicted, the Panther's turret began traversing toward them. For 3 seconds, its thinner side armour would be exposed. Martinez had the armour-piercing round loaded before the first shell casing finished bouncing around the turret floor. Up! Fire! The second round caught the Panther in the side, penetrating just below the turret ring. Not a catastrophic hit, but enough to disable the turret traverse. The German tank lurched forward, trying to angle its hull to bring the gun to bear while the crew fought to regain control. Load HE. Gunner, target the second Panther. This was where the old ammunition layout made all the difference. Martinez could see both HE and AP rounds in the racks around him. He could select, grab, and load without thinking, without hesitation, without fumbling with floor hatches. The rhythm became mechanical. The Sherman fired again, and again, and again. In 45 seconds, Fury Road fired 8 rounds. The first Panther was disabled, smoke pouring from its engine deck. The second had retreated behind a stone wall after taking an HE round that damaged its tracks. The third was ranging for a shot, its gun elevated slightly, searching for the muzzle flash that would pinpoint Fury Road's location. "Back up," Rothwell ordered. 50 meters. Henderson threw the tank into reverse. The Sherman lurched backward through the barn's shattered wall and into a pre-scouted position behind a low rise. They had perhaps 10 seconds before the Panthers' round arrived at their old firing position. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The shells struck exactly where they had been, the explosion showering the barn with fragments of stone and frozen earth. But Fury Road was already repositioning, already preparing for the next engagement. Martinez had reloaded. The ready rounds in the turret basket were depleting, but there were still 24 more in easy reach before they would need to access the wet storage below. This was the reality of tank combat in the winter of 1944, not the clean theoretical engagements described in training manuals. Not the carefully calculated armor penetration tables and optimal firing ranges. Just brutal, close-range slugging matches where survival depended on who could put more rounds downrange faster. For the next 2 hours, Rothwell's platoon, 4 Shermans total, traded fire with German armor around St. Vith. They used terrain, smoke, and sheer volume of fire to compensate for their disadvantage in armor and gun power. Of the 4 Shermans, 2 were destroyed. One took a direct hit to the turret from a Panther's 75mm gun. The round penetrated, struck the ammunition racks that Martinez's counterpart had loaded in the sponsons, and the tank erupted in flames. The entire crew was killed instantly. The other Sherman was hit in the hull, the round passing through the driver's compartment and exiting the other side without striking ammunition. The crew escaped, though Henderson, the driver, died from his injuries. It was the exact scenario the wet storage was designed to prevent, and it had worked in that tank. The ammunition didn't burn, but the crew died anyway because the engagement had already been decided by the time the hit occurred. Rothwell's tank, Fury Road, survived. Kowalski counted the engagements afterward. They had fired 43 rounds in 2 hours of combat. The first 35 had come from the readily accessible racks, maintaining an average rate of fire of close to 15 rounds per minute during active engagements. The final 8 rounds required Martinez to access the wet storage, slowing the rate to approximately 6 rounds per minute. By that point, the intensity of combat had decreased, German tanks had withdrawn, and the slower loading time didn't prove fatal. But the lesson was clear. Those first 35 rounds, fired at maximum speed, had kept them alive. The question that haunted Rothwell afterward was whether the crew of the Sherman that brewed up would have survived if they had followed regulations. Would the slower rate of fire have allowed them to destroy the Panther before it could fire? Or would they have died anyway, just without the fire? The debate raged through the winter of 44 into the spring of 45. Ordnance Department officials conducted investigations into reports of crews violating wet storage protocols. Some units received direct orders to comply with ammunition stowage regulations, backed by threats of court-martial. Other commanders, particularly those who had seen combat themselves, quietly looked the other way. The official position remained unchanged. Wet ammunition storage was mandatory for crew safety, but the statistics told a more complex story. Analysis of Sherman losses in the European theatre from June 1944 through May 1945 revealed that approximately 60% of destroyed Shermans were hit by German anti-tank fire before their crews could engage effectively. Another 25% were hit during engagement, but before they could disable the enemy vehicle. Only 15% of losses occurred after successful enemy engagements, where the Sherman's rate of fire might have made a difference. However, survival rates told a different story. Crews that maintained higher rates of fire, whether through violation of wet storage protocols or exceptional loader skill, had a 23% higher survival rate in tank versus tank engagements. The combination of volume of fire and crew training proved more decisive than armor thickness or gun penetration power. A Sherman that could fire 15 rounds per minute had a better chance of survival than one that could fire only 8, regardless of whether the ammunition was in wet storage. The Ordnance Department faced an impossible choice. Enforce regulations and potentially increase casualties due to reduced firepower, or tolerate violations that increased fire risk but improved combat effectiveness. In typical military fashion, they chose a middle path: continue requiring wet storage while quietly acknowledging that experienced crews would find workarounds. Technical Sergeant Earl Morrison, a loader with the 3rd Armoured Division, developed what became known as the Morrison method. He kept precisely 18 rounds in easily accessible locations, 6 in the official ready rack, another 12 distributed between carefully selected sponson positions and a modified turret basket rack. The remaining ammunition stayed in wet storage. His reasoning was mathematical. In 90% of engagements his division experienced, 18 rounds were sufficient to either destroy the enemy, force a withdrawal, or necessitate the Sherman's own withdrawal. For that critical 90%, rate of fire remained high. The remaining 10% of extended engagements required accessing wet storage, but by that point, the tactical situation usually allowed for the slower loading pace. Morrison's method spread through tank companies with remarkable speed. It represented a practical compromise between safety and effectiveness, acknowledging both the danger of ammunition fires and the necessity of rapid fire. By March 1945, informal surveys suggested that approximately 70% of Sherman crews in frontline units used some variation of Morrison's method or similar modifications. The practice reached its zenith during the crossing of the Rhine in late March. As American forces pushed into Germany itself, they encountered increasingly desperate German resistance. Hitler Youth and Volkssturm units deployed Panzerfaust anti-tank rockets, deadly at close range, but requiring German troops to get within 75 meters. The Wehrmacht's remaining armor, though scarce, fought with the fury of men defending their homeland. Every engagement became a close-range brawl, where fire rate mattered more than armor thickness. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. 2. Corporal Martinez, Rothwell's loader, perfected his craft during the Rhine campaign. He could identify ammunition types by touch in complete darkness. He memorized the location of every round in the turret. He developed a loading rhythm that became second nature. Grab with the left hand, pivot at the waist, guide with the right hand, slam home, step back, 3.2 seconds per round, sustained. During one engagement near Remagen, Fury Road fired 27 rounds in 90 seconds while advancing under fire. Martinez's hands moved faster than conscious thought, pure muscle memory born of repetition and desperation. The toll of this pace was physical. Loaders developed chronic back problems from the repetitive twisting motion. The 11-kilogram weight of each 75mm shell, multiplied by dozens of rounds per engagement and multiple engagements per day, destroyed shoulders and elbows. Martinez wrapped his hands in cloth to prevent burns from handling hot shell casings. His hearing, despite the tanker's helmet, deteriorated from the repeated concussion of the main gun firing in the enclosed turret space. But he was alive, and so was his crew. In a war that killed tank crews at appalling rates, that was victory enough. The modifications weren't limited to ammunition storage. Innovative tank crews found dozens of ways to improve their Shermans' combat effectiveness, most of them technically unauthorized. Some welded spare track links to the hull front, adding improvised armor. Others modified the turret traverse to be slightly faster, though this risked damaging the hydraulic system. A few enterprising crews even modified their gun sights, adding improvised range-finding marks based on combat experience rather than factory specifications. The most common modification, however, remained the ammunition stowage. Because it was invisible to officers conducting inspections, because it could be quickly reversed if necessary, and because it made such an immediate, tangible difference in combat effectiveness, it became nearly universal among experienced crews. First Lieutenant Robert Hayes commanded a Sherman company in the 1st Armoured Division. In April 1945, preparing for what everyone hoped would be the final push into Germany, he assembled his tank commanders for a briefing. The official agenda covered maintenance schedules and ammunition allocation. The unofficial agenda, the one that mattered, covered survival. "Gentlemen," Hayes said, standing in front of a map of their sector, "I'm going to state the obvious. Wet storage is regulations. It saves lives. It prevents ammo fires." He paused, letting that sink in, then continued, his voice lower. "It also gets you killed if you can't put rounds downrange fast enough. Every commander in this room knows crews are keeping ready ammo accessible. I know it. Battalion knows it. Division probably knows it." The tank commanders shifted uncomfortably. This was the kind of conversation that could end careers or court-martials. Hayes continued. "I'm not going to order you to violate regulations. That's not my place. But I'm also not going to pretend I don't know what's happening. What I will say is this. Use your judgment. Keep enough accessible ammunition to survive the first critical minutes of engagement, but understand the risk. If you brew up because of an ammo hit, you won't be around to say, 'I told you so.' Neither will your crew." It was the closest anyone in authority came to officially sanctioning the modifications. A tacit acknowledgement that combat imposed its own logic, one that didn't always align with regulations written far from the front lines. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. Staff Sergeant James Rothwell survived. So did Corporal Martinez. Fury Road, battered and scarred, was still running. They had fought from Normandy to the Elbe River, through hedgerows and forests and German cities. They had faced Panthers and Tigers and Panzerfausts. They had violated regulations and improvised and adapted and survived. In the years after the war, the US Army conducted extensive reviews of tank combat in Europe. The conclusions were complex and sometimes contradictory. Wet ammunition storage had prevented thousands of catastrophic fires and saved countless lives. But crew modifications to maintain high rates of fire had also proven crucial to survival in many engagements. The official recommendation was to redesign future tank interiors to accommodate both safety and accessibility, a lesson that would inform the development of the M26 Pershing, the M46 Patton, and eventually the M48 and M60 series tanks. But those were future tanks, designed with the wisdom of hindsight. For the crews who fought in Shermans, the modifications were immediate, practical solutions to the problem of staying alive. They represented the eternal tension in military operations between centralized control and frontline initiative, between safety regulations and combat effectiveness, between doing things by the book and doing whatever was necessary to survive. The Shermans' theoretical 20 rounds per minute rate of fire was never officially increased. The specifications remained unchanged. But in the hands of experienced crews who understood both the risks and the necessities of combat, the Sherman could maintain that rate far longer than its design intended. Not through engineering improvements or factory modifications, but through the simple expedient of putting ammunition where it needed to be. Regulations be damned. This wasn't innovation in the traditional sense. It wasn't a brilliant engineer developing a new system or a visionary commander implementing a revolutionary tactic. It was something more fundamental, soldiers adapting to survive. Taking a machine designed by experts and modifying it based on the brutal education of combat, understanding that sometimes the greatest danger wasn't the risk you took, but the risk you avoided. Martinez never forgot the crew that died in the Sherman that followed all the regulations. The tank with every round properly stored in wet ammunition racks, the tank that didn't brew up when it was hit, the tank whose crew died anyway because they couldn't fire fast enough. He wondered sometimes if those men had made the right choice, if following the rules had given them any comfort in their final moments, if they had regretted their decision as the Panthers' gun elevated toward them and their loader fumbled with floor hatches. He never found an answer, only the cold arithmetic of survival. In tank combat, measured in seconds and shells, rate of fire wasn't just a technical specification. It was the difference between going home and being buried in a military cemetery in Belgium. The official history books record that the M4 Sherman medium tank had a rate of fire of 20 rounds per minute with its 75mm M3 gun. They record that wet ammunition storage, introduced in late 1943, reduced ammunition fire casualties from 90% to 15%. They record that over 49,000 Shermans were produced and that the tank served in every theatre of World War II. What they don't record is the quiet conspiracy of thousands of tank crews who understood that specifications and survival were sometimes at odds. Who knew that the machine gun specifications and battlefield reality demanded different solutions? Who violated regulations not out of rebellion, but out of the simple desire to live through the next engagement? Staff Sergeant Rothwell returned to civilian life in 1946. He never spoke much about the war, never told stories about the modifications or the close calls or the decisions that kept him alive. But on the rare occasions when veterans gathered and the conversation turned to tanks, someone would eventually mention ammunition stowage. The room would go quiet. Veterans would exchange glances, the kind of understanding that required no words, because they all knew. They had all faced the same choice: safety or speed, regulations or survival, the right way or the way that worked. In the end, thousands of Sherman crews chose survival. They kept ammunition within reach. They maintained the rate of fire that gave them a fighting chance against superior German armour. Some died because of that choice, burning in ammunition fires that wet storage might have prevented. Others lived because of it, their speed overwhelming enemies before they could return fire. The modification that was never officially authorized, never formally recognized, never entered into the technical manuals, proved as important to the Sherman's success as any factory improvement. It represented the adaptability and initiative of American tank crews, their willingness to take calculated risks, their understanding that survival in combat required more than following orders. The Sherman tank that fought across Europe wasn't quite the tank that rolled off Detroit assembly lines. It was something better and more dangerous, a machine modified by the men who fought in it, adapted to the realities they faced, improved by the brutal education of combat. The official rate of fire remained 20 rounds per minute, but the effective rate of fire, in the hands of crews like Rothwell's and Martinez's, could be sustained far longer than any specification sheet suggested. Not because engineers had designed it that way, but because men fighting for their lives had made it so. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.